Good morning. Welcome to Hydrock's webinar on whole life carbon assessments under the London Plan. My name is Graham Munday. I'm the Marketing Director at Hydrock. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a short, sharp webinar on this particular topic, and we'll take some questions at the end as well, which you can post into the question box. I wanted to start by just briefly introducing our two presenters, and then I'm just also then going to return and talk very briefly about Hydrock if you don't know our business too well. So our two presenters today are first of all Charlotte Grames, who is a senior consultant in our sustainability and smart energy team in London. Good morning, Charlotte. How are you?
Hi, good morning, Graham. So I'm just here just outside London. I'm based in the southeast. I'm in my son's bedroom at the moment. Our temporary office is in his nursery. So if there's any sort of, toy paraphernalia laying around, I do apologise.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Charlotte. So we'll come back to you in a second. And your co-presenter today is Sam Jones, who's the Director of Energy and Sustainability in our specialist Hydrock MRB team. Good morning, Sam. Where do we find you today?
Morning. I'm at home in Wakefield today, and me and my wife were discussing which books to have on the bookshelf behind me this morning for the presentation. So we've gone with Harry Potter up the top and Asterix a few shelves below. So yeah, that's been the main thing to concentrate on. Everybody's
enjoying looking at what's in everybody's house at the moment. I'm afraid I'm in the office today for this particular thing. So we will return to Charlotte and Sam in just a second. If you don't know Hydrock terribly well, if you're joining us today, you picked this up from somewhere and thought, oh, that sounds interesting, but don't know us that well. Just very briefly, we're a UK-wide consultancy specialising in the built environment, in particular focusing on sustainability, energy and engineering design. From a London perspective, our team has partnered, we're very proud to have partnered with Glen House Architects on the new facilities for English National Ballet, which very recently was voted Building of the Year by Architects Journal. We're also heavily involved in some major regeneration schemes across London, the Biscuit Factory in Bermondsey, a former Kodak site in Harrow, and a former Nestle site in Hayes as just three examples. We also have a strong fire engineering and sustainability team in London. They're working with local authorities, the fire engineering team, for example, working with Camden Council, in particular on fire risk assessments relating to external wall fire reviews, a very topical issue at the moment. And our sustainability team are doing a lot of work with Newham Borough Council on one of their homes programmes and looking at sustainability for that, which just gives you a flavour of the kind of things that Hydrock does. At the end of the webinar, I'll also just reference, and I will reference it now if I may, a couple of events that we've got coming up in November. We have an event around air quality coming up in November, and we're also doing a piece on battery storage and how that can unlock development sites as well. And if you missed that at the end, but you're interested in details, you can always email us at events@hydrock.com, and either myself or one of the marketing team will always pick that up and respond to you. But for today's event, as I say, it's a quick fire run through. Do post your questions and we will take them at the end. It's a quick fire run through of the fact that developments of scale across London and the boroughs are due to be affected by some detailed carbon calculations that will come in under the London Plan. So the question is, what do you need to do? What are the impacts? How does it affect planning? And to kick us off, Charlotte will lead us off on that. Charlotte, over to you, and I know you're sharing your screen with the slides.
Great, thank you for that intro, Graham. So yeah, as Graham sort of briefly mentioned, we're going to run you through the sort of climate emergency and how the whole life carbon calculations sort of relate to that. Why is it important? The what, when and the how to the GLA requirements, and some key risks and opportunities that will come from this process. So I'm just going to quickly take you through some of the background to why whole life carbon is becoming more prevalent and why it's so important. So as many of you will probably know, in order to avoid the most significant impacts of global climate change, the Paris Agreement requires global temperature rise to be limited to 2 degrees C. To achieve this goal, the UK have legally committed to becoming net zero by 2050. In order to meet this target, within the construction industry in particular, we'll need a major transformational change about how we think about a zero carbon development. Currently, we're rather heavily focused on operational regulated net zero, and we're going to have to spend as much energy and time focusing on embodied and whole life carbon if we are to be truly net zero. So whole life carbon is the carbon emissions resulting from the construction and use of the building over its entire life, and that includes demolition and disposal. This includes operational carbon. Now, this is something that we're all familiar with. This includes the regulated and unregulated carbon emissions. So regulated emissions are those that are covered under Part L of the UK building regulations, and these include heating, cooling, water and lighting. And within London at the moment, we have to reduce our regulated carbon emissions by 35% and then offset to net zero in order to gain planning. And I'm sure most of us are becoming relatively comfortable with those requirements. Unregulated loads are sort of plug-in emissions from things like laptops, your computers, TVs and white goods as well. Whole life carbon also includes embodied carbon. So embodied carbon covers a building's life cycle emissions from cradle to cradle. And these are categorised sort of A through D, and you can see these sort of different types of emissions shown in the sort of diagram here. So your A emissions cover raw material extraction, the manufacturing process of building materials, transport to site and construction activities on site as well. B emissions, the operational stages which we've just talked about, so your regulated and unregulated emissions. And embodied carbon also goes beyond this, and consideration is given to C and D type emissions, and these are associated with maintenance, so during the building use, replacement of any materials during the use of the building, and the eventual deconstruction, demolition and disposal process. And a whole life carbon assessment would have to consider all of these aspects for the building project. So why is whole life carbon so important? Now I just want to go through a couple of graphics which I think highlight really nicely why this is becoming such an important issue. So this first graph here shows the construction industry's performance against the roadmap to 80% carbon reduction emission scenario set by the Green Construction Board. We've actually already fallen behind where we need to be to get to an 80% carbon reduction scenario. So there is a lot of work to be done. But what I think is really interesting sort of about this graph is it shows from sort of 2014, the construction industry has reduced operational carbon by approximately 32% compared to 1990 levels, which is great. So we're well on the way there to kind of reducing our carbon emissions. However, since the last, since the end of the recession, sort of embodied carbon, sort of shown here, has actually steadily increased. It's really important moving forward as we get towards the sort of zero carbon operational energy, our embodied carbon becomes much more important. So just one final sort of little graphic from me. I think this is a really good, really highlights how important this is. This shows the typical breakdown of whole life carbon for different projects. So we have a warehouse, a resi scheme, an office and supermarket. And our operational, so those regulated and unregulated energy sort of carbon loads are shown in the yellow slice of the pie here. And even though they only make up less than 50% of our overall carbon emissions for these developments, these are the most heavily regulated at the moment under the planning process and the building regulations. But what about the other sort of 50, 40%, 50, 60% of our carbon emissions? They're almost relatively unregulated. And to fully become net zero, we're going to have to start regulating embodied emissions in a similar way to our operational carbon. And the proposed whole life carbon assessments set by the GLA are the beginning of this sort of shift in regulatory change. And Sam is just going to take you through some of the nuts and bolts of what this assessment process entails.
Thank you for that, Charlotte. We thought it would be useful to cover the what, when and how in relation to the whole life cycle assessment required by the GLA. So what would be required from the GLA as part of the assessment? At what stage of the planning and construction process would this be needed before addressing how we would actually deliver this? So first off, what is included? So the draft London plan states that if adopted, next slide please, Charlotte, that if adopted, a whole life cycle carbon assessment will be required for all planning applications referred to the Mayor, although assessments will be encouraged for all major planning applications. The main criteria for referable applications are for developments of 150 or more residential units, those over 30 metres in height, those on green belt or metropolitan open land. So the local planning authority will be required to refer the whole life cycle assessment to the Mayor's office, and if the current energy statements are anything to go by, we would expect comments back from both the local planning authority and the central GLA office on these. So what will the whole life cycle be required to cover? Charlotte has already mentioned the GLA are expecting the full A to D life cycle modules to be covered as part of this work. This is a full cradle to grave analysis, including benefits and loads beyond the system boundary over its lifetime. So that accounts for the operational carbon emissions, both regulated and unregulated, embodied carbon emissions, and then any future potential carbon emissions, including any benefits from reuse and recycling of the building structure and materials at the end of life. So the emerging London Plan policy states that all the building elements which are applicable should be included. So you need to include for any demolition of existing buildings and any facilitating works on site. So the whole of the new building, so substructure, superstructure, finishes, fittings, furnishes, any building services, any external works, drainage, landscaping, and also any work you're doing to existing buildings on the site. So we envisage this whole life cycle report to be a separate standalone report in addition, which would be in addition to the existing energy or sustainability statements, which are already a requirement for referable applications. It will be different to an energy statement though, as it will just that just takes into account regulated and unregulated energy and operational emissions. But these operational figures from that energy statement will be inputted into the whole life cycle results as they fall within module B of the life cycle. It's also quickly worth pointing out that unlike the life cycle analysis required for the BREEAM MAP 1 credits, there is a difference in scope, and the credits and the two reports won't be interchangeable, even though they will go towards each other. So the BREEAM report for new construction only covers the substructure, hard landscaping and superstructure within the standard credits, plus the building services as an innovation. So benchmarking may possibly be the most important part of the future of the GLA's whole life cycle requirements. So this is in effect their equivalent of the 35% operational carbon reduction as required for the energy statements. So the submitted assessment will be assessed against a range of carbon benchmarks, enabling schemes with emissions that exceed the stated benchmarks to assess how to reduce their whole life cycle emissions. These benchmarks have been based upon previous buildings, so the level set should be reasonable, but until these assessments are undertaken, it will be difficult to judge if these are achievable, or what a typical type of construction to allow buildings to comply will be, or any easy wins to ensure a building can meet these standards. A further set of aspirational benchmarks have also been developed based upon a 40% reduction in emissions from the initial ones, but these are only aspirational at the moment and may be a precursor of future targets from the GLA. So within the current emerging guidance, the benchmarks are based upon offices, retail, education, apartment and hotels only. But we expect this probably will be expanded for the adopted planning guidance to include a few more building types. And it's also worth mentioning the benchmarks are based upon the whole life cycle modules, except B6 for operational energy, B7 for operational water, and D for benefits and loads beyond the system boundary, such as reuse of materials at the end. We think this is mainly because the operational energy is already covered within the energy statement requirements, 35% or zero carbon, and the operational water is typically within BREEAM or local planning standards for many boroughs. So there are currently no penalties proposed for not meeting the benchmarking standards, even though the GLA would ask you to explore options to reduce the emissions if you exceed the target. However, it's likely that we would expect this to be brought in the future, with possibly a levy introduced as per the carbon offset levy, which was introduced for firstly regulated emissions below 25% and 35% and now to zero carbon standards. So next is when the whole life cycle assessment would be expected to be submitted to the GLA. So this is confirmed for planning applicants to submit at 3 stages, which is shown on the slide. For all of these stages of assessment, the GLA has produced a whole life cycle carbon assessment template tool as a format for consultants to use and follow. So for the pre-application stage, the assessment is qualitative rather than quantitative, but still requires specialist input and a significant amount of reason, justification and explanation of project decisions. So the calculator tool includes 16 whole life cycle reduction principles for which the design team has to confirm if the principles have been adopted, with examples if they have and justification if they haven't. These questions, quite broad brush, so they link in with other energy and sustainability requirements such as minimising operational energy use through a fabric first approach, minimising operational water use and construction waste generation. It also considers wider questions such as local sourcing of materials, the use of lightweight construction materials, the circular economy and the use of recycled or repurposed materials. At the outline and detailed planning stage, a baseline whole life cycle assessment is required against each of the applicable life cycle modules. So outline planning stages could be based upon default figures from the RICS professional statement for whole life cycle assessments, but as the design is expected to progress further at detailed design submission, planning submission, it is expected that this will be based upon bespoke building assumptions using approved life cycle assessment software for the specific building design. So applicants will be expected to submit the quantity of all material types within each building element category, which will be similar to a stage 2 pre-planning submission life cycle assessment carried out for BREEAM purposes. But as previously mentioned, the GLA will ask for a wider range of materials and information to be provided, not just a relatively narrow scope for BREEAM. You'll also be expected to summarise any key actions to reduce whole life cycle emissions that have informed the assessment and be incorporated within their design. So reflecting the recent changes to the energy statement requirements to use updated SAP 10 or 10.1 carbon factors, the GLA will also ask for 2 assessments to be submitted for the whole life cycle at detailed planning submission. One for the current state of the electricity grid and the second for the expected decarbonisation of the grid. And then finally, at post-construction stage, applicants will be required to complete the post-construction calculator tool, submit this to the GLA within 3 months of practical completion of a development. This will require an update of the bespoke life cycle assessment using approved software submitted at detailed planning. And the assessment now will be based upon actual material quantities and site emissions during construction of the building. As with the detailed planning submission, 2 assessments based upon the current state of grid electricity and the expected decarbonisation will be expected to be submitted. And this stage of assessment is not currently included within a BREEAM assessment. The BRE does ask for a REBA Stage 4 technical design update post-planning submission, but not for assessment at the end of construction. It's also worth mentioning that the GLA would expect this to be completed for handover and be submitted within 3 months after PC. So finally from me, how are the whole life cycle assessments expected to be delivered? So the GLA guidance requires that the whole life cycle assessment should be carried out using a nationally recognised assessment methodology and should demonstrate the actions that have been taken to reduce emissions of the proposed building. There are several software tools which the GLA have confirmed are suitable to use to undertake the assessment. At Hydrock, we use the one-click LCA tool, which is the largest database of material products, using both generic data for materials, for example, concrete manufactured in Britain, or actual individual manufacturer-specific products with their own specific tested embodied carbon. So input from the design and construction teams for the quantities of materials used, manufacturers of materials, operational energy and water consumption, plus construction site energy and water records will all be required to complete the whole life cycle assessment. The main issue we envisage here will be the involvement from the main contractor to provide this construction site information, such as the site energy and water usage, in addition to all of the procured product quantities and manufacturers information. As with the start of all similar processes, though, once it's been undertaken on several sites, design and construction teams will learn what is required to complete an assessment, and it should become a standard part of the procurement and site operation process. In the future, it may be that there is an ongoing role for the whole lifecycle consultant through the design and construction process to check design and material changes against the GLA benchmark, ensuring that post-construction lifecycle results do not incur any penalties. This would be similar to the ongoing role currently for an energy assessor to continually check against the 35% carbon reduction improvement.
So we're just going to finish off by highlighting some key risks and opportunities that we think will likely arise from this assessment process. So investment and scalability. Whole life carbon assessments are going to be mandatory on referable schemes in London, so try and make the most of good marketing. The general public are now becoming a lot more informed, and a fully holistic low carbon development is going to have much greater scalability than one that is not. From an investment perspective, the Paris Agreement requires all finance flows to be consistent with a pathway towards zero carbon and climate resilience. This is now a requirement by European banks and institutional fund investors. Now more than ever, funds are looking for sustainable investments with good environmental, social governance strategies that put net zero high up on the agenda, and adding this to your ESG will show commitment to low greenhouse gas emission future and aid investment decisions. One of the key risks for us that we really want to highlight is the planning risk. So delays in carrying out the assessment at any of those project stages, so pre-app, planning application, and eventually post-construction, could result in significant programme delays, whether that is delay in getting your planning application submitted or delays in getting it sort of approved or disapproved. Benchmarking is another one of the sort of key risk areas. So at the moment, as Sam sort of went through, the benchmarking scheme is completely voluntary and you don't have to show any improvement over the benchmark, although you are encouraged to do so. In the future, we think it might be likely that the GLA are going to ask for similar levels of performance against these benchmarks than they do for operational carbon. So at the moment, we have to show our 35% improvement and then offset to zero carbon. Is this going to be a similar thing they're going to bring in the future for embodied carbon and whole life carbon? And furthermore, the GLA are actually going to be putting a lot of scrutiny into the reporting of whole life carbon. They're going to be looking at, has this been done holistically? Has this included all of those areas that they've asked for within their guidance documents? And has the report been done to good, high technical quality? So it's really important that we programme this into the design programme properly. So that has been a really quick sort of coffee break overview of whole life carbon assessments and what that will sort of mean for the GLA and moving forward. If you take anything away from this sort of webinar, we'd like to highlight these sort of key things moving forward. So whole life carbon is going to be really important in meeting our net zero goals for 2050. The 3-tier assessment process, which is slightly different to other sort of reports that you have to do for planning, so the pre-application stage, planning application stage, and post-construction. Early engagement is really important to help mitigate any potential programme delays. And just a bit of a thought piece really, so London is really pioneering by actually asking for whole life carbon to be reported and calculated through the planning process. This is not currently assessed anywhere in the UK, but it's likely that other local authorities are going to be sort of following suit further down the line. So if we don't have to do it now, it's going to have to be done in a few years' time, sort of elsewhere in the UK as well. So yeah, just going to hand back to Graham. I think he's going to manage to have a bit of Q&A. If anyone has any questions, we're more than happy to answer them, or we can obviously answer them after the fact as well.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte and Sam. Thank you so much for that. Yes, we'll take a few questions. We've got one or two on screen that I will go through. If you do want to ask a question, it'd be great if you could put your name and company name in there. I'm actually going to start with one from myself, and Charlotte, I don't know whether you want to go for this. I hope this is not an unfair question. What is the current status of the London plan?
So at the moment, we don't have a date for when it's going to be adopted. But a lot of the emerging policies in the Emerging London Plan are actually being asked to be included at the moment. So sort of the future energy performance and the use of SAP10 carbon factors. So it's likely that this could be asked for referable applications moving forward, but we don't have an official adoption date yet. Okay,
that's great. Thank you. Let's take a couple of the questions being posted. Do post some more. We're going to still keep this quite tight. I know everybody is always extremely busy. John Setra of K2 asked, will the new requirements apply to mixed use buildings?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of think there's a couple of questions actually about which buildings they're required to. I know there's one for mixed use and there's one for healthcare as well.
There is.
Yeah, they will do. They'll apply to them. The benchmarks in the emerging guidance are only for the ones I mentioned, but I imagine things like healthcare, there'll be new benchmarks for those. For mixed use, they might just ask you to work out the amount of office, retail, apartments that within that mixed use building, and then take almost an area weighted calculation from all three. But I think this is stuff that once the actual final adopted guidance is out from the GLA, that's when we'll have a better idea of these sorts of nuances of the requirements.
Okay. Thank you, Sam. What work somebody's asked a question here, what work has been undertaken to date which looks at the cost, impact and benefit of whole life carbon and building design, and how will this be priced in? Which of you would like to take that question?
I can take that one if you like, Sam. So there has been some work undertaken sort of at the moment, and the UK Green Council have been looking at cost impact reviews in line with guidance provided by LETI and the RIBA. This work sort of looks at typical building types and the cost uplifts to meet sort of low carbon and net zero guidelines. However, it's purely sort of capex related and doesn't take into account any of the OPEX savings and future asset value. It's actually something that we're quite interested in within Hydrock. So within our team, we probably might be looking at that moving forward. So not a huge amount of work at the moment that I'm aware of, but people are looking at it, and moving forward, I think there is a really interesting sort of piece of work to be done looking at the sort of the cost impacts in terms of life cycle cost, as well as sort of the carbon side as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take this question from Steve Waters at SW Planning. So Steve says, and I will publish this in a second, Steve says, what schemes are or will be submitted for benchmarking? In other areas, i.e. build costs, many large developers don't provide these to BCIS due to commercial sensitivity. Thus, those that are used are often small schemes, not representative of the costs of larger developers. Is there a risk benchmarking figures may get skewed by just a very small number of scheme details submitted, causing difficulties in meeting the requirements? Does one of you two want to take that question?
Yeah, I can. In terms of the benchmarking, Steve, it's for an embodied carbon, so it's reported in kilograms of CO2 per metre squared. So it's not to do with the costs. I know there is a life cycle costing assessment which you would see for BREEAM, but it's not that. It's to do with the embodied carbon. So it's just as you would do. You would report your operational carbon as part of your energy statement. I don't think there'll be anything commercially sensitive in reporting that, but I might be wrong. And in terms of where these benchmarkings have come from, the GLA have confirmed it within the guidance. I'm just trying to find it quickly. Yeah, so they're based on previous projects carried out by a couple of other companies and cross-referenced with data from the various LCA, the LCA tool operators. So it's people like OneClick, people like eTool. So they've taken a few previous projects, checked it with the actual tool, embodied carbon tool operators, to make sure that they've been correctly done and undertaken before setting these benchmarks. But again, I think as you try to get across, the benchmarks aren't set in stone. You don't get penalised for not meeting them at the minute. And I think that'll be because they'll want to see what results they get for the next few years coming in before actually setting down actual benchmarks, because it's not regulated like Part L would be for operational energy. They'll want a bit more evidence and a bit more guidance as to what schemes typically do achieve before they set those in stone and actually start having penalties for not meeting them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and take maybe just a couple more questions here. Stephanie asks, where do you think that embodied carbon levels are increasing within buildings? Do either of you want to tackle that? Is that a big question? I don't know.
Again, I don't know if you want to deal with this, Shab, but I think from the graph you showed in the actual presentation, they're pretty much staying the same, aren't they? I think so. I don't think there is much change at the minute, and I think that's partly what the issue is that the operational energy has been driven down by Part L operational carbon reduction targets, but the embodied energy is just kind of staying as it is. There's no real targets to drive it down, which is which is going to hinder our ability to meet net zero carbon in 2050. So that's partly what these standards are for, and these updated planning. So I assume once London take it on and start doing the embodied carbon, other planning authorities around the country will do as well.
Okay, thank you. And then a question here, which is probably quite a practical question. Where can I find a template form? Where can I find a template form for whole life carbon benchmarking for residential development?
I think in terms of a template, the GLA do provide sort of a bit like in a similar guise as the energy assessment sort of guidance. They do have a guidance document, but I'm not sure what you mean by a template. You could find sort of RICS and many other places have sort of examples online where you can look and fill in the details. And there is a accompanying spreadsheet provided by the GLA to this, so that easier for them to kind of understand with the reporting. So that could probably be the best sort of template that you could find, and that's just downloadable from the GLA website.
I mean, Charlotte, how many are there examples now of fully worked through examples of whole life carbon assessments, you know, through the 3 stages? How predominant is that at the moment?
As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen many examples that have worked through the 3 stages in line with the GLA requirements, because obviously it's not current sort of practice at the moment. So most of the assessments that are done at the moment are predominantly for BREEAM, which is a bit of a different sort of assessment process and requirement.
Okay, and the difference with BREEAM, there is a question here which I might just take as the final one before we conclude here. I mean, you did touch on this, Sam, and I know this is an area of your expertise as well. There is quite a difference, isn't there, between BREEAM and what's being asked here?
Yeah, do you want me to take this one, Charlotte?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's 3 stages to the GLA requirements. So the very early pre-app one, which isn't part of BREEAM at all, but the part to do with submission at detailed or outline planning, there would be quite a crossover between the 2. The BRE only want quite a slimmed down scope of what you actually need to assess in terms of the building materials. So you need to look at the substructure, the superstructure, and the hard landscaping. So you'd be able to do that for BREEAM, and then you would need to add in extra parts for the actual GLA when you submit pre-planning. So you'd have to look at the internal fit out, the building services, any demolition as well for the GLA. So there will be some crossover between that. There is a requirement as well for BREEAM to submit a further LCA at REBA stage 4, which is technical design, I think, which isn't part of the GLA guidance. The GLA guidance just asks for one between the pre-app detailed planning and one right at the end of the job.
Okay, thank you. We're going to call it a day there, if I may. It's just gone 11:30, and we wanted to keep this quite short and sharp. Charlotte and Sam, thank you so much for your time this morning, and to everybody who's joined us, thank you as well. Just to say, we've got a couple of events coming up on the 11th of November. We're talking about how to turn air quality cost calculations into a financial positive. So look out for some details on that. And later in November, across Northern England, we're putting a panel together to discuss battery storage and how battery storage can potentially unlock a number of development sites and make them very viable. If you're interested in details of any of our events, and you don't think you're necessarily on our mailing list or whatever, do just drop us a line like the couple that I've just mentioned there, at events@hydrock.com. And we will certainly share them and be back in touch with you on those. Thank you so much for your company this morning. Hopefully that was useful. We promise to keep it short and sharp. It's now 11:35. Thank you to Charlotte and Sam, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.